How is modern-day Africa still grappling with decisions made at a conference in Berlin over 140 years ago? In 1884, European powers met in Berlin to divide Africa, not for the benefit of its people, but for economic control and imperial dominance. In this video, we will dive into how the Berlin Conference sparked a wave of colonial exploitation, creating a system that extracted Africa's wealth and left behind a history of economic inequality and political instability that continues to impact the continent today. The Berlin Conference, also known as the Congo Conference, was a meeting between European powers who came together to divide up the African continent amongst themselves, without involving any African nations or leaders. But to understand how and why Africa was divided, we must first explore the forces that set the stage for the conference, the ambitions of the European powers, and the devastating consequences their actions would have on the people and societies of Africa. Let's begin by looking at what led up to the Berlin Conference and how Africa, for centuries relatively untouched by European colonization, suddenly became the target of an international land grab. Chapter 1. The Scramble for Africa. We need to step back and examine the circumstances that gave rise to the so-called Scramble for Africa. By the mid-19th century, Europe was undergoing a period of tremendous change. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing, and European powers were rapidly expanding their economies, manufacturing capabilities, and military strength. However, Europe's industrial expansion came at a cost. Factories and industries required an ever-increasing supply of raw materials, and European markets demanded more products. But Europe alone could not provide the resources necessary to sustain this growth. The natural solution for these industrial powers was to look outward, to find new territories, new markets, and new sources of wealth beyond their own borders. Africa, with its vast lands and rich natural resources, quickly became a focus of European ambitions. Though European explorers had been present in Africa for centuries, they had largely confined their activities to coastal trading posts. Much of the African interior remained unknown to Europeans. However, by the mid-19th century, advances in navigation and medicine, particularly the discovery of quinine, which helped combat malaria, allowed Europeans to venture deeper into the continent. At the same time, new military technology, such as the Maxim gun, gave Europeans a significant advantage over African resistance forces. The first to capitalize on this shift were nations like Britain and France, which established colonies in West Africa, Egypt, and parts of southern Africa. Soon, however, other European powers like Germany, Portugal, Italy, and especially Belgium joined the rush to claim African lands. It was a race fueled by greed and rivalry, as each nation sought to expand its empire and secure access to the continent's wealth of resources. One figure who played a particularly influential role in the early stages of this scramble was King Leopold II of Belgium. Although Belgium was a small country in comparison to other European powers, Leopold had grand ambitions. He saw in Africa the opportunity to establish a vast personal empire and set his sights on the Congo Basin. In 1876, under the guise of humanitarian efforts, Leopold established the International African Association, which he claimed would promote the civilization of Africa and eliminate the Arab slave trade. But his true intentions were far more sinister. Leopold's Congo Free State, which would later become infamous for its brutal exploitation of local populations, was just one example of how European powers justified their colonization efforts through a mixture of humanitarian rhetoric and economic ambition. But as more and more European nations began staking their claims in Africa, tensions between them grew. Territorial disputes between rival powers threatened to escalate into armed conflict. Something had to be done to regulate these claims and ensure that the scramble for African land did not lead to open warfare between European nations. Thus, in 1884, the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck convened the Berlin Conference. Bismarck, though not particularly interested in acquiring colonies for Germany, saw an opportunity to enhance Germany's international standing by playing the role of mediator. The conference would set the rules by which Africa would be divided, ensuring that Europe's imperial ambitions could be pursued in an orderly fashion. Chapter 2. The Berlin Conference. Between November 1884 and February 1885, representatives from 14 European nations gathered in Berlin to negotiate how Africa would be divided among them. The nations involved included Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, Italy and Spain, among others. However, what is most striking about the Berlin Conference is the complete absence of any African leaders or representatives. Africa was, quite literally, divided up like a pie, without the knowledge or consent of the people who actually lived on the continent. The primary goals of the conference were to avoid conflict between European powers and establish guidelines for colonizing Africa. Among these guidelines was the principle of effective occupation. According to this rule, European powers could only claim a territory in Africa if they had established actual control over the land, which meant building infrastructure, establishing a military presence, and governing the local population. This was meant to prevent European nations from simply declaring vast regions of Africa as their own without physically being there. Additionally, the conference established free trade zones along the Congo River and Niger River. These rivers were vital for transporting goods and resources across the continent, and by guaranteeing free trade along their routes, the European powers ensured that they could continue to exploit Africa's resources without unnecessary restrictions. European powers often pointed to the goal of ending the Arab slave trade as a key motive. Arab and Muslim traders had been involved in the African slave trade for centuries, capturing and exporting enslaved Africans across the Indian Ocean, Middle East and North Africa. However, the supposed mission to end this practice was often used as a facade by both European and Arab powers to mask their true intentions of exploiting Africa's vast resources. European colonizers, particularly under figures like King Leopold II of Belgium, presented themselves as liberators of African people from the brutal Arab slave trade, while continuing their own systems of forced labor and exploitation. In reality, this humanitarian justification served as a cover for imperial expansion, allowing European and Arab powers to carve out control over African territories. Though slavery was gradually abolished in many regions, the underlying motivations were economic, with both Arab traders and European colonizers seeking to benefit from Africa's resources, rather than genuinely improve the lives of its people. One of the most significant outcomes of the Berlin Conference was the formal recognition of King Leopold II's Congo Free State. Leopold had cleverly marketed his control over the Congo as a humanitarian project, claiming that his goal was to bring civilization to the African interior and end the Arab slave trade. In reality, the Congo Free State was Leopold's personal colony, and under his rule it became one of the most brutal exploitation regimes in history. Millions of Congolese were forced into labor to extract rubber and ivory from the forests, and those who failed to meet quotas faced horrific punishments, including mutilation and death. The Berlin Conference also led to the drawing of new borders across the African continent. These borders, drawn with little regard for the continent's existing ethnic, cultural, or linguistic divisions, would have long-lasting consequences. In many cases, rival ethnic groups were forced into the same colony, while others were split across different colonial territories. This artificial division of Africa would later contribute to the outbreak of civil wars and ethnic conflicts in the post-colonial era. By the time the conference ended, nearly 90% of Africa had been divided between European powers. Britain took control of vast swaths of territory, including Nigeria, Egypt, Kenya, and South Africa. France secured large portions of West Africa, including Senegal, Mali, and Ivory Coast, while Germany, a relative newcomer to the race for colonies, claimed parts of modern-day Namibia, Tanzania, and Cameroon. Portugal, Belgium, and Italy also carved out their own empires, creating a patchwork of colonies across the continent. The decisions made at the Berlin Conference would set the stage for the colonial exploitation of Africa, an era marked by the extraction of the continent's resources and the brutal oppression of its people. These nations, driven by greed and competition, divided Africa without the involvement of any African leaders. Chapter 3. The resources Europe sought. The Berlin Conference wasn't just about drawing borders, it was about wealth, specifically the vast wealth of natural resources that Africa possessed. The industrial powers of Europe were hungry for the materials that could fuel their growing economies, and Africa's lands, forests, and mineral wealth offered exactly what they needed. From rubber to gold, diamonds, and timber, the European powers set their sights on Africa's natural bounty, and they were prepared to extract it by any means necessary. One of the most sought-after resources was rubber, particularly in the Congo Free State. In the late 19th century, rubber had become a vital commodity, essential for producing tires for the newly invented automobile and other industrial goods. Under the rule of King Leopold II, the Congo became one of the largest suppliers of rubber in the world. But this came at an enormous cost. Leopold's regime forced millions of Congolese people into labor camps where they were made to harvest rubber from wild vines in the forests. Failure to meet quotas often resulted in mutilation, with hands being cut off as punishment or death. The human toll of this exploitation was catastrophic. Historians estimate that as many as 10 million Congolese died as a result of Leopold's brutal policies. Ivory, too, was a major target for European powers. African elephants were hunted to near extinction in many parts of the continent, as European demand for ivory products skyrocketed. Ivory was used to make everything from piano keys to fine carvings and jewellery, and European traders made vast fortunes from the trade. In regions like West Africa and Central Africa, entire communities were displaced or forced into hunting elephants for European markets. In South Africa, it was gold and diamonds that attracted the attention of the British Empire. The discovery of diamonds in Kimberley in 1867 and gold in the Witwatersrand region in 1886 led to an influx of European settlers and the establishment of vast mining operations. Figures like Cecil Rhodes, the founder of De Beers, played a key role in consolidating British control over these resources. African labourers, meanwhile, were forced to work in dangerous conditions in the mines, often for little or no pay. The profits from these mines flowed back to Britain, helping to fuel its industrial economy, while African workers faced exploitation, injury, and death. Another important resource was copper, particularly in the Katanga region of what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Copper was essential for electrical wiring and industrial machinery, and European powers were eager to tap into Africa's rich copper reserves. Belgian companies dominated the copper mining industry in Katanga, extracting vast amounts of wealth while local populations were subjected to harsh working conditions and environmental degradation. Africa's forests also provided valuable timber. Hardwoods like mahogany and ebony, found in the forests of West Africa, were highly prized in Europe for making fine furniture and shipbuilding. Logging companies, often British or French, established large-scale operations in places like Nigeria and Ghana, cutting down vast tracts of forest and disrupting the livelihoods of local communities who depended on the land. Beyond minerals and timber, European powers also sought to transform African agriculture to serve their needs. Large-scale plantations were established in colonies like Kenya, Angola, Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and Mozambique. Crops such as coffee, tea, cocoa, sugar and cotton were grown for export to European markets, with little of the profit staying in Africa. The plantation system often relied on forced labor, as Africans were coerced into working on European-owned farms to pay the taxes imposed by colonial governments. These taxes were often payable only in European currency, forcing Africans into a cash economy that benefited the colonizers. While the European powers reaped enormous profits from Africa's resources, the cost to Africa was immeasurable. Millions of Africans were displaced, forced into labor, or killed as a result of European exploitation. Entire ecosystems were destroyed, and the traditional economies and societies of Africa were irrevocably altered. The wealth extracted from Africa flowed into the coffers of European governments and corporations, while the continent itself was left impoverished and devastated. Chapter 4. The impact on Africa. The impact of European colonization on Africa was not limited to the extraction of resources. The social, cultural, and economic fabric of the continent was profoundly altered as European powers imposed their will on African societies. Culturally, European colonizers introduced their own languages, religions, and legal systems, often at the expense of local traditions. Christian missionaries played a key role in this process, bringing European education, religion, and values to African communities. While missionaries often saw themselves as benevolent figures, their efforts to civilize Africa contributed to the erosion of indigenous cultures. African languages were often marginalized, replaced by European tongues like English, French, and Portuguese. Local systems of governance and law were disregarded in favor of European legal codes. This cultural imperialism had a lasting impact on African societies, as European values and institutions became dominant in many parts of the continent. Economically, the transformation of Africa into a collection of colonial economies meant that the continent's resources were extracted for the benefit of European powers, while little of the wealth remained in Africa. Colonial governments imposed taxation policies that forced Africans to work for wages in order to pay their taxes. This often meant working on European-owned plantations, in mines, or on construction projects, where conditions were harsh and wages were low. The imposition of European economic systems disrupted traditional agricultural practices and forced many Africans off their land, creating widespread poverty and food insecurity. In many parts of Africa, the forced labor system became the norm. Africans were coerced into working in mines, plantations, and factories under brutal conditions. In the Congo Free State, the rubber industry relied entirely on forced labor. The social and economic disruption caused by European colonization left deep scars on Africa that persist to this day. Many African nations remain dependent on exporting raw materials, a legacy of the colonial economy that was designed to benefit Europe. The infrastructure that was built during the colonial era, such as railways, ports and roads, was often intended solely to facilitate the extraction of resources rather than to support local development. This has contributed to the underdevelopment of many African nations as they struggle to build sustainable economies in the post-colonial period. The Berlin Conference may have been a meeting of European powers, but its decisions had a profound and lasting impact on Africa and its people. The artificial borders drawn by Europeans, the exploitation of Africa's resources, and the imposition of foreign cultures and economic systems all contributed to the continent's long-term challenges. The consequences of these actions are still felt today, as African nations continue to grapple with the legacy of colonialism. Chapter 5. The Colonial Era. Despite the overwhelming force of European colonization, African resistance was widespread. From the very beginning of the colonial era, African communities fought back against European domination, often at great cost. In East Africa, the Maji Maji Rebellion of 1905 was one of the largest anti-colonial uprisings. Tens of thousands of Tanzanians rose up against German rule, protesting the harsh labor policies and the forced cultivation of cotton. The rebellion was brutally suppressed by the Germans, who used machine guns and scorched earth tactics to crush the resistance. It is estimated that as many as 300,000 Tanzanians died as a result of the rebellion and the subsequent famine caused by the destruction of crops. In German Southwest Africa, modern-day Namibia, the Herero and Nama peoples mounted a fierce resistance against German colonization in the early 20th century. The Germans responded with brutal reprisals, killing tens of thousands of Herero and Nama in what is now recognized as the first genocide of the 20th century. By the end of the conflict, between 65,000 and 80,000 Herero and around 10,000 Nama had been killed, either in battle or in German concentration camps. In West Africa, Samurai Toure led a sustained resistance against the French, establishing a powerful empire that stretched across parts of modern-day Mali, Guinea and Ivory Coast. Samorai's army was well organized and equipped with modern weapons, and for years he successfully defended his empire against French expansion. However, in 1898, after decades of resistance, Samurai was captured by the French and his empire was annexed. One of the most famous examples of African resistance was the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, in which the Zulu kingdom fought against British forces in what is now South Africa. The Zulus, led by King Cetshwayo, won a stunning victory at the Battle of Isandlwana, where they annihilated a British force of over 1,300 men. However, the British eventually regrouped and defeated the Zulus, leading to the collapse of the Zulu kingdom and the annexation of their lands by the British. Despite these acts of resistance, European powers maintained control over Africa for much of the early 20th century. However, the seeds of anti-colonial movements were already being sown. African leaders and intellectuals, many of whom had been educated in Europe, began to challenge the legitimacy of colonial rule, demanding independence and self-determination for their nations. After World War II, the push for decolonization gained momentum. African nationalist movements grew stronger as countries like Ghana, under the leadership of Kwame Nkrumah, became the first to achieve independence in 1957. Over the next few decades, one African nation after another gained independence. But the legacy of colonialism, artificial borders, ethnic tensions, and economic dependency continued to create challenges for these newly independent states. Chapter 6. The Global Response. While the Berlin Conference was a monumental event in shaping the future of Africa, it's important to understand the global context and why the rest of the world largely allowed this division to happen. The conference was, after all, a European-led affair with no involvement from the African nations whose land was being divided. But what did other nations think, and why was there so little intervention? At the time, many global powers were focused on their own concerns. The United States, for instance, was preoccupied with internal matters, such as the Reconstruction era following the Civil War, and expanding its influence across the American continent with the ideology of manifest destiny. The US government did not have significant colonial ambitions in Africa and had adopted a policy of non-involvement in European imperial disputes, which explains its limited interest in the Berlin Conference. Meanwhile, Asia was facing its own pressures. China was weakened by internal strife, including the Taiping Rebellion, and external threats like the Opium Wars with Britain. With its sovereignty under constant threat from foreign powers, China had little ability or interest in intervening in African matters. Japan, though undergoing its Meiji Restoration, was still in the early stages of industrialization and focused on regional expansion, not global imperial ambitions at the time. Latin America, having recently gained independence from Spain and Portugal, was focused on its own political and economic development. Countries like Brazil, Argentina and Mexico were more concerned with stabilizing their newly formed governments and economies than with European imperialism in Africa. For much of the non-European world, the events of the Berlin Conference were distant and seemingly unrelated to their immediate concerns. Additionally, European imperialism had been normalized by centuries of colonialism. Many countries did not have the power, resources, or strategic interest to challenge Europe's growing dominance in Africa. The Ottoman Empire, though a declining power, had its own struggles and conflicts in the Middle East and Eastern Europe. With European powers already encroaching on its territories, it had no leverage to challenge the division of Africa. Finally, within Europe itself, there was little opposition to the scramble for Africa. Imperialism was seen as a natural extension of power, and the wealth and resources it provided were vital for the growing industrial economies of the time. In fact, imperialism was often celebrated in the press and by political leaders who viewed the control of African territories as a measure of national greatness. The Berlin Conference was viewed not as an atrocity, but as a diplomatic achievement that helped avoid war between European powers. In short, the rest of the world allowed this division to happen because of a combination of internal challenges, limited interest, and power dynamics that favored Europe. The long-standing acceptance of imperialism and the lack of any significant global powers willing to intervene meant that the Berlin Conference went largely unchallenged. Chapter 7. The long-term consequences. The decisions made at the Berlin Conference left a lasting mark on Africa, one that continues to shape the continent's political, social, and economic landscape to this day. Economically, the colonial period left Africa dependent on the export of raw materials to Europe and other global markets. Many African nations continue to struggle with the legacy of this colonial economic system, as they remain reliant on the export of commodities like oil, minerals, and agricultural products. The lack of industrial infrastructure and investment during the colonial era has hindered the development of diverse, self-sufficient economies in the post-colonial period. Culturally, the imposition of European languages, religions, and legal systems continues to influence African societies. English, French, and Portuguese are still the official languages of many African nations, and European-style legal and political institutions remain in place. While African nations have worked to reclaim their cultural identities and traditions, the legacy of colonialism remains deeply ingrained in many aspects of African life. The Berlin Conference stands as a stark reminder of the power dynamics that shaped global history, where entire continents were divided and exploited for the benefit of a few imperial powers. The decisions made by European nations in Berlin, driven by greed and imperial ambition, left a legacy of conflict, exploitation, and underdevelopment that Africa continues to grapple with today. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the Berlin Conference and its lasting impact on Africa and the world. If you found this video informative, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Let us know which historical event or figure you'd like to see next. Your ideas help guide the stories we tell. And as always, this is HistoryCrafts, where history crafts itself.